Good morning, everyone. My name's Will Kennedy. I'm the Executive Editor for Energy at Bloomberg News, and it's my great pleasure to moderate this morning's very distinguished conversation on innovation and technology diffusion and climate change, organized by IMF. The panel doesn't really need an introduction, but we'll do it quickly. Kristalina Georgieva, Managing Director of the IMF, Fatih Birol, Head of the International Energy Agency, and Dr. Ngozi, Head of the World Trade Organization. So it's an absolutely stellar panel, and I'm sure we're going to have a fantastic conversation to start our Sunday morning here. But first of all, today's conversation is based on some research by an IMF team, and we're going to just have a short video, a couple of minutes, to introduce that research and give us a foundation for this morning's discussion. So please just turn your eyes to the screen for a couple of minutes.
We stand at the edge of a historic opportunity. Imagine a world where innovation isn't just a key to solving the climate crisis, but also a driver for economic growth. Welcome to the power of green innovation. Over the years, we've witnessed incredible strides in green technology, from electric cars to renewable energy and beyond. But recently, the pace of this innovation has slowed. The slowdown is a concern because green technologies are essential for the fight against climate change, and we need them to reach lower-income countries where they can make a real difference in reducing harmful emissions. However, here's the exciting part. Green innovation, it's not just about combating climate change. It's also a catalyst for economic growth. Our research shows that doubling green patent filings can boost a country's GDP by 1.7% in just 5 years, and some estimates go as high as 4 times the effect. But how do we foster this green innovation and make it accessible to all? This is where coordinated climate policies come into play. By implementing policies like emissions trading schemes, feed-in tariffs, and research subsidies, we can supercharge green innovation. And it's not just about domestic policies. Global climate agreements like the Paris Agreement have a massive impact. They create a larger market, encourage technology diffusion across countries, and boost confidence in governments' commitments. By acting together, we can not only foster green innovation, but also spread low-carbon technologies to countries that need them the most. But beware of protectionism. High tariffs on green technologies and subsidies that favor domestic producers can hinder progress and lead to duplication of efforts across countries. It's crucial to lower these barriers and embrace climate policies that comply with international rules. And let's not forget, advanced economies where most green innovation happens have a vital role to play. Sharing technology with emerging and developing economies is a win-win. It reduces emissions and brings economic benefits to those who need it the most. Green innovation isn't just about saving the planet. It's about creating a brighter and more prosperous economic future for all. It's time to turn the page on a new chapter in the history of our world, where climate action isn't a burden, but an engine of equitable economic growth.
Well, I think that sets things up very nicely for the discussion this morning. If I can start with you, Kristalina. One of the things that comes across there is that green innovation has slowed down a little bit, and we're not getting the economic and the climate benefits that we should be. From your position, what are the policy levers we can use to reinvigorate innovation?
Let me first thank my colleagues for being here, because this is one of the most important conversations we ought to have when we talk about both climate and the fact that global growth has been quite anemic and continues to be so. We are projecting growth over the next 5 years at only 3%. This contrasts with 3.8% in the decade before COVID. So it's necessary to get the transition to the new climate economy, as well as the digital transition, to give us a boost of productivity. So for us at the IMF, this is a vital conversation on both counts, climate and growth. What can be done? Well, start with the simplest, which is create a stronger incentive for both technological innovation and diffusion by removing harmful subsidies that we know are making it less pressing for us to move to a greener future. Our research shows that, unfortunately, because of the cost of cost of living crisis, fuel subsidies have gone up to $1.3 trillion this last year. And if you take the indirect subsidies, not having a carbon price, the health costs of pollution associated with both CO2 emissions and other pollutants, we are going up to $7.1 trillion. So step one, take this out. Step two, introduce all the incentives that pricing carbon can bring. And pricing carbon wrongly is always associated only with tax. And it is true that political conditions in some countries make it very difficult to talk about tax increase of any kind. But it can be done through trade, and it also can be done just by simply moving standards up and up and up. And number three, be much more open to bring investment in innovation. In other words, there is a good subsidy, and it is called R&D subsidy. We saw over the last decades a strange thing. Green patents were going up and up until 2010, around that time. They got to be 10% of all patents. And then, since then, what we have seen is that green patents have gone actually slightly down. And there are many explanations why. Because pumping oil has become cheaper. Other reasons are also in place. But if we know that this is happening, then please push R&D aggressively, both in advanced economies and by supporting emerging market developing economies, their researchers, their innovators to do more.
Thank you very much. If I could move on to you, Dr. Birol. When we think about the global economy and why it's a bit slower, China is absolutely key. And China is, of course, the hub of so much green innovation. If we think about EVs, if we think about the solar industry. Is China a concern for you? And do you worry about the impact a slower China economy has on this issue of getting green innovation going and spreading it around the world?
Some of you may know that in September this year, we said, and I'm sure Bloomberg wrote a lot about this, fossil fuel consumption will peak before the end of this decade, before 2030. So this is since decades and decades never has happened, fossil fuel consumption, oil, gas, and coal always increased, and it is going to peak before 2030, even if there are no new clean energy policies, with the current policies. And there are two drivers of that. One of them is clean energy economy is moving fast and faster than many of us realize. Just electricity generation, this year, more than 80% of all power plants installed in the world is renewables, more than 80%. Electric cars, you just mentioned electric cars. 3 years ago, only 3 years ago, 1 out of 25 cars sold was electric. 1 out of 25 3 years ago. This year, 1 out of 5 cars sold is electric. 2030, with the most conservative, every second car sold with an electric car. So this is one reason why we see fossil fuel consumption will peak. But the second one is China. Dear colleagues, China was the single most important driver of not only clean energy, but at the same time fossil fuel consumption. Many energy analysts got the China wrong in the last 10 years. China surprised everybody. But it is economic growth and relation to fossil fuel consumption. More than two-thirds of the global oil consumption growth in the last 10 years came from China. So more than two-thirds. More than one-third of the global natural gas consumption growth came from China. Coal, big chunk of coal consumption growth came from China. And Chinese economy in the last 10 years increased more than 6% per year. And now, everybody agrees, including the Chinese government, it is going to slow down and change the structure from an energy-intensive economy to a lighter economy. So instead of 6%, 3%, 4% growth. So putting these two things together, namely, the clean energy is moving very fast globally, and at the same time, Chinese economy is slowing down, means we will see the peak of fossil fuel consumption globally before 2030. And China, I mentioned that a major fossil fuel driver, but China is also number one in solar panels, more than 80%, number one in electric cars, number one in wind, number one in hydro, number one in I can go and go and go. So, and China made a big service to the international community by bringing the cost of these technologies down. So, and this is the beauty of having a good strategy and beauty of having a international trade. Trade is a very good driver of bring the cost of these technologies down and stimulate the innovation.
Well, I think you've made a very good introduction for Dr. Ngozi there. Dr. Ngozi, I mean, when we think about the policy picture here and how to drive green innovation and its spread around the world and reap the economic benefits as widely as possible, where does trade fit in for you? What are the things that we can be doing for a trade perspective to drive this forward?
Well, Fatih, maybe I should just keep quiet and let you do the talking, because this is why we're here. You know, it's to make people realize that you can't really get to net zero by 2050 or reach any 2030 targets without trade. You can't have diffusion of this green technology without trade. And like Fatih was saying, I think the drop in the cost of solar technology and wind technology has been largely driven by trade and the supply chains that have led to this being produced so cheaply and then getting much more over the world than it would have been without trade. So trade is a critical factor in moving technologies from one place to the other. You know, let me make two more points about trade. So for that reason, we need to look at the tariffs also. Because if you have high tariff barriers, then that creates a disincentive for adoption. And one of the things we are pointing out, we just released a brochure that shows 10 trade measures that countries need to adopt. I don't know if one of my colleagues has a copy. And one of the things, we wanted to show that trade, people think of it as a negative force when we come to to low carbon decarbonization. But there are so many trade policy actions. And one of them is looking at your import tariffs. We often find that in many countries, we have lower tariffs on fossil fuel goods than on green goods and renewables. So, you know, you have to look at that relativity and change it. Now, we've seen that average applied tariffs on environmental goods in developed countries is about 1.4%. And then in developing countries, about 7.3%. This is what our research shows. So there's room within developing countries to reduce. We are hoping that we can perhaps persuade our members to go back to talking about an environmental goods and services agreement that will help bring these tariffs down. But I have a little bit of bad news to add on this. From tariffs, we have technical barriers to trade. And this is looking at regulations. And when we look at that, we find that developed countries, unfortunately, have technical barriers to trade that cover about 81% of the environmental goods and services. this is not very good news. In emerging markets and and upper middle income countries, it's 51%, and in developing countries, lower income countries, 45%. So you can see, so even when you lower tariffs, you still have to look at what regulation is doing. So that is one thing. And we've estimated, according to research we've done, that if you could open up trade, remove some of these barriers to energy-related environmental goods, you could raise their exports by 5%, and that could lead to a 0.6% reduction in emissions by 2030 per year. So that is not trivial. Every bit helps. So this is how trade can really be important. Let me just end by making one more point. We worry about subsidies because the wrong type of subsidies, as Kristalina said, can really be anti-competitive. And also if you have requirements for local content that go against the rules, as we said, that can be problematic. But they are good subsidies. Research and innovation, and we should be pushing more in that direction. I want to completely agree. Perhaps later on, I'll have a chance to say something about our intellectual property agreement, which governs some of this, but let me stop for now.
Thank you very much. If I could just pick up on one of the things you started with, Kristalina, you talked about just the scale of fossil fuel subsidies and how that is a big problem for this agenda, and how, in fact, the current economic backdrop meant those subsidies are increasing. Doesn't that make you feel a bit bleak? Are there any signs of hope that that shift is starting to happen among governments from those subsidies to the structure that you'd like to see?
The first thing that gives me hope is just law of economics. Countries have been forced to spend to counter COVID, and then the war in Ukraine, and the cost of living crisis. And guess what happened? They ran out of space. So what we are advocating, and we see a great deal of pickup in our membership, is more fiscal discipline, phasing out support measures, and then keeping only those that are for the most vulnerable in societies. And that is going to help. But more significantly, I think the recognition that is happening here at COP, that fighting climate change is a dual objective. It is existential. We fail, we are cooked. But it is also an economic necessity, because if we are to move aggressively with the right type of subsidies, subsidizing a rapid decarbonization, we have a tremendous opportunity for green growth and green jobs. When I look at the world today, how it changed over the last 10 years, who are the countries on the front line of advocating for climate action? These are the most vulnerable countries. I used to go to Africa 10 years ago, 15 years ago, and Ngozi would know that very well. And when I say climate change, normally the reaction would be, not our problem, this is rich countries' problem. No more. So that change that has happened globally in recognition that action is necessary is what we need the most. Pressure from the street on policymakers to do the right thing. And of course, we are there to propose the right policies, policies that actually are good for growth, and they are also good for climate.
It may be a bit of an unfair question, but are there any countries where you could highlight who you think are getting this particularly right at the moment?
You know, you're probably aware that we have created a new financial instrument. It's called Resilience and Sustainability Trust. We have engaged very rapidly with it. We now have 11 programs, more are coming. And in each and every one of these countries, we see progressive policy thinking. Countries like Barbados or Jamaica or Costa Rica or Kenya, the way they think about green industrialization, green development is fantastic. What we do for these countries, we create fiscal space to take the right policies forward. When I look at the world of more mature, large economies, certainly the European Union deserves a lot of praise. There is this hiccup with fossil fuel subsidies most recently, but they're pulling out of it. And everywhere where the understanding that carbon price is a must, and there you have about 50 countries, I think of them as the champions of policy transformation. So it's not just, I mean, sometimes we get very negative, oh, it's horrible. It's not that horrible. We are waking up. We just need a little bit of push to move faster.
Fatih Birol, in a recent report that you stressed that a big part of what's needed to cut emissions are technologies that aren't quite ready yet. Hydrogen, perhaps, is a good example. Which of those technologies would you highlight, and what can policymakers do to really drive them forward so that we can get the innovation that we need and then spread it around the world?
Okay, I will tell you this briefly, and I will also say why I am rather optimistic now. First, if we want to solve this climate problem, we have two jobs. One, in terms of innovation and technology. One, we have already some available technologies, cost-effective and so on, already on the table. We have to see a massive expansion of these technologies. What are those? Solar, wind, electric cars, efficiency, heat pumps, whatever. They are already available, and we have to find ways to push them through different policies, different incentives, and so on. This is one. But they alone will not be enough existing technologies to reach our climate goals. We need other technologies to be part of the game. Especially, there are two areas which we are still behind, and these are two heavy emitting areas. One of them is the so-called the energy-intensive industries, iron, steel, cement. These are major emitters, but we cannot yet, for example, with the renewables, we can fix the problem. With solar or wind, we can fix the problem in iron, steel, or in the cement or petrochemicals. This is one area. The second area is the transportation for long-haul transportation with the trucks, buses, and the airplanes. This is another area. So for this, we need new technologies to be moving and being economic, such as the hydrogen you mentioned. This is an extremely important technology, but to be honest with you, when I go around the world, everybody talks about hydrogen, but the amount of FID we got for hydrogen projects are about 3% of the projects which are talked. There is not much FID coming there. And another one is for carbon capture and storage, but mainly for the technologies I mentioned to you, because I see that some people think the carbon capture and storage will fix all of our problems, which is not true. It is mainly for these hard-to-abate sectors, and we have to push the second job, not only massive expansion of the existing ones, but such as solar and wind and EV, but these new technologies we have to push, and here, government subsidies, government incentives, policies will be very important. One small point, why I am hopeful, and I agree with Kristalina saying that we shouldn't be too pessimistic. I mean, it depends on the day. I am sometimes pessimistic, sometimes today is just started with a pessimistic note, but maybe it can improve in the afternoon, what we will hear. But looking more strategically, I have two reasons to be optimistic. One, the innovation is very strong, and many governments are pushing now clean energy technologies, not only to save the world, but to have a good position in the next chapter of the industry sector. Yes. But the next chapter is the clean energy technology manufacturing. It is the next chapter. So if they don't want to be behind. They want to position themselves for the next one. It is the China, it is the US, it is Europe, it is India, Indonesia, they are all coming. And climate change is not the main driver, to be honest with you here. This is the first thing that makes me hopeful. The industrial development and the innovation, technological innovation there makes me hopeful, regardless of political issues. But the second one, more important, namely, not only the people in Paris or New York or Sydney raising the alarm bells for the climate change. I think the people in the streets of, I don't know, in Jakarta, Delhi, Nairobi, Rio, they are now seeing, linking the extreme weather events they are experiencing on a daily basis and increasing fossil fuel use. If they are seeing this, there will be a lot of scrutiny on the governments, on the companies. The more we see extreme weather events, the more will be that international public pressure on the governments, on the companies, and on the decision makers. So it will come, and it will not come only from the advanced economies, it will come from all the countries.
Can I ask if you actually agree with that point, Dr. Ngozi, as someone from an African country? Do you think that in the developing world that political pressure is coming and that this is a big change that we've seen?
I will agree with some of that, and I'm also optimistic on some days and pessimistic on others. Well, because I'm an optimist by nature, I tend to be more optimistic. Yes, there is a lot of pressure coming. I'll tell you, in my village, farmers are noticing a difference. So it's not just on the street. The other time, we've been having flooding in my country, and I was speaking to the farmers. Some of them who are older said, you know, it used to be once in 32 years we had these floods. Now it's once every 3 years. The rain comes at the wrong time. We don't know when to plant and when to harvest. So quite apart from young people on the streets, the farmers are feeling that something is happening, and they're also saying to government, what is going on? We need to change. But I want to come to one thing, one area. Whilst I'm optimistic that we will get the investment into new technologies that will help, and we just did a paper with IRENA, the WTO and IRENA, a joint paper that we are launching here on green hydrogen. My team is there that did the work. And as you say, there's not as much investment going into it. The question that I have is most of this technology is being developed in the developed countries because that's where they have the capital. There's no fiscal space, and not as much for all of these in developing countries. The question comes, if we are all in this together, and we've had a market failure as well as the government failure, how are we going to get this technology? So we talked about trade being one route and keeping tariffs down, but we also need to know that what we are in, we have to deal with a global public bad. And therefore, we also have to be in advance thinking of how to make these technologies available to developing countries in a reasonable way and at reasonable prices. I hope we are not going to repeat the lessons that or we learned the lessons from the pandemic, where developing countries, poor countries were at the back of the queue for vaccines, and people were dying when we had a technology that could save lives. Now, we have the intellectual property agreement. I often ask my staff, why is the trades-related intellectual property agreement governing intellectual property resides at the WTO, and it puts us in the crosshairs. And what happened was that when we had the pandemic, we had a lot of pressure from civil society, to let this waive the intellectual property requirements, whereas industry was on the other side telling us that this will kill everything they're doing. It was a terrible situation to be in. And I do want to say that we need to think now ahead of time. I was speaking to about 100 CEOs a couple of nights ago about this. How do we deal with this problem of intellectual property rights and access to technologies? So one or two things to talk about here. First, under that agreement, there is a provision that least developed countries should be given access by developed countries. And we see some of that happening in the environmental area. We've seen about 150 projects, or if you want to call them activities, where developed countries have tried to give access to developing countries. But often they can't make very good use of this because of the state they're in. And I don't think it's not deliberate. I'll come back to that. I think the other thing, though, is for middle-income countries and others, I would suggest that the private sector gets ahead of the curve, you know, and look at voluntary licensing requirements where they can have more say, you know, a kind of patent pooling through the World Intellectual Property Organization. They have a technology partnership platform that can help do this. But as we sit here, I don't see a rush to do that. So whilst I'm optimistic that, you know, governments may put the subsidies in the right place, we need to press on getting access to developing countries. Otherwise, they'll be left at the end of the queue. So that is one thing that I want to sound the alarm now, and so we can avoid making the same mistakes.
May I just support this argument with one important dimension? Why developed countries should, it is on their own interest to support the developing countries. Leave aside the ethics, moral responsibility, historical responsibility. If you want to protect the worst impact of climate change in Europe, for example, even European emissions tomorrow goes to zero, but not even -5, -0. If the developing countries continue as they are now, without having access to clean energy technologies, emissions going from those countries would have an impact on Europe. So emissions don't have a passport. Emissions going from Europe or from Asia or Latin America or Africa has the same effect on Europe. So it is, even for selfish reasons, very important for the developed countries to support the developing countries having the access to clean energy technologies. Forget all the other things, just for selfish reasons.
Can I jump in?
Of course.
This is becoming interesting. I think there's one more point. We also need to know that now many developing countries, including African countries, can have a comparative advantage in things they can be green at. I love a phrase that our chief economist came up with. Look, we green hydrogen, there's not much investment, but now we see a lot of interest in Europe. Chancellor Schulz said the other day they are willing to put like 4 billion into this. Others are coming in. And we have Kenya. Yesterday we were at a dinner with President Ruto where he was trying to persuade investors that, look, we're ready for this. 90% clean energy from hydro and thermal. You can come in here and develop your supply chains. You can diversify and do the critical minerals, not just come and extract them, but develop the energy sources, put the whole value chain for critical minerals on the continent, not outside. And at the same time grow and create jobs. So this is a win-win-win that we have here, and I think we must push for that.
And I'm sorry to make it even more. So, of course, the other benefit is much lower cost. So we achieve our objective cheaper. The point I want to make is a comparison between the Montreal Protocol and where we are today on climate. The Montreal Protocol is seen as the biggest success in environment. Why was it successful? Because people in developed countries were getting skin cancer from emissions that were mostly coming from developing countries. It was so obvious, you want to be healthy, you help these countries, you pay. We are now in a very similar situation when the growth of emissions is coming from developing countries, but already the devastation on economies because of a changing climate is hitting rich countries, and guess what? They have more wealth to lose. So I think we need to make this point over and over and over again, hammer it. It is, of course, morally right, but it is self-interest.
It's a fascinating subject. We've only got a few minutes left, and I just want to get at one more thing before we finish quickly, which is the issue of good subsidies and bad subsidies, if you like. Because one of the biggest things that's happened in climate investment and climate technology in the last year is the Inflation Reduction Act. Now, clearly, that has some protectionist tinge to it, whether it's the local content. What's your view of that? Do you just see it as a mixed bag? It's good because the US is getting serious, but do you worry about some of the protectionist flavor in things like that?
Yeah, it would be good if we are careful about this protectionist flavor. Of course, when you are a very big economy, what others may do to retaliate may not be so significant. But we know from long history of experience that when one country takes protectionist measures, others retaliate, or at least they follow suit. So the risk is of a down spiral that would make us all poorer and as a result less secure. But is the discussion on subsidies moved to a point when we say to accelerate decarbonization, good subsidies, and they are in R&D, in public infrastructure that makes private investments possible. Think of charging stations, for example. And very important, in investing to remove barriers in developing countries to receive more private investments. And that is something that we at the fund take very much to heart. This is good use of public money.
Dr. Ngozi, I mean, obviously this is probably a subject close to your heart. Is there a point you'd like to make on this issue?
Yeah, it's very close to our hearts, and I have to be very careful what I say. Last time I get back to Geneva and find I have no job. I have very active members. So the point is this, look, you know, from this legislation, it's obvious that different countries are going to use different approaches to get to the same objective of decarbonizing by their target 20. So the US is never going to do carbon pricing. So they will use subsidies and regulation. And that is okay, because we can measure the equivalence of what they're doing and come up with a carbon price. So that's not the issue for me. The issue is things like local content requirements we have to be very careful about. It is that some of our members, just like I said about some of the EU policies yesterday, some of our members feel that this may be not giving them a level playing field, just like some members will complain about China not providing a level playing field, or the CBAM. So when members have complaints about each other's policies, then we need to pay attention and make sure that you know, there's a level playing field. That's what we're there for. The good news is we provide a forum to do that. We have you know, these committees where members can come to share with each other what their concerns are and be able to work it out. We also actually have now in the committee, one of our committees on trade and environment, and Holim here is the director responsible, members are working out what types of subsidies would be good that they can agree on. And I think this will be very helpful because I think we need to come to agreement. What are the right types of subsidies to have? How should we implement them to avoid this phenomenon of undercutting each other and putting in anti-competitive policies?
Very quickly, Fatih Birol, would you like to end with any thoughts on this question of bad subsidies and local content and how we deal with those risks?
Very briefly, because we are already 1 minute late. What I see is that the more you protect your decisions, industrial sector, your innovation, the more you see slower rate of innovation, and the cost of reduction of technologies will slow down. So it's a bad thing. It is to be very well balanced, but I am afraid the wind is blowing currently from the wrong direction.
Please, everyone, join me in thanking this great panel on a wonderful conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Pleasure.
Yes.
Really enjoyed it.